I was frightened and isolated. Even though I somehow knew that Will was the real Will, I found no comfort in that. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't work, and I couldn't make the connection between what was real and what wasn't real. The next day, after my third missed appointment with him, Kaplan called and insisted I go up in my Zyprexa. Although I knew in my soul that he wasn't really Kaplan, I paid attention to him because I was just that desperate and miserable, and over the next several days, the delusion slowly passed. If I was still harboring any hope that I could somehow be free of the need to take antipsychotic medication, losing both Kaplan and Steve to my psychosis convinced me utterly, ending the passage. The only way to understand why the Capgras episode was so disturbing to me is to understand that these relationships were a tether to my own humanness. If I lost these ties to my humanness, I might really no longer be human. I am not speaking in metaphor here. I quite literally thought that I might no longer be human if I lost them. I've been talking here about myself and relationship. I would like to return to say a few more words about my relationship with my mental illness and how I conceptualize that relationship. When I moved to Los Angeles from New Haven, my analyst and I developed a way of talking, a sort of heuristic about my illness and my relationship to my illness. There were, in our manner of speaking, three me's: Elyn, Professor Saks, and the lady at the charts. I could not imagine integrate these three aspects of myself. How could I be a thinker of big thoughts, an academic, if my mind were so damaged? How could I be both Professor Saks and the lady of the medical charts? And where did Elyn fit in all this? What took a huge amount of effort, and what was ultimately self-defeating, was to keep them separate. I wasn't sure who was the real me. This confusion expressed itself in an intense ambivalence toward taking my medication. For many years, my motto was, the less medicine, the less effective. Steve was a virtual saint. He spent literally years of our relationship going through time and time again when I tried to get off my medication with disastrous results. It wasn't simply I didn't like the side effects of my medication. The need to take the medication reached to the core of my identity. If I could get by without medication, maybe I wasn't really mentally ill and the lady at the charts would disappear. Only Elyn and the professor would be left as a real me. This cycle culminated in one final effort to get off my med several years after I'd been on the faculty of USC. Reading from the text. While White had supported me many times in my efforts to get off medication, which I undertook with great gusto and failed miserably at each time, one battle between Kaplan and me concerned the use of medication. Early on, we really locked horns over this. Kaplan thought I should just stay on the meds and get on with my life. For me, as I said, my motto was the less medicine, the less effective. Part of the way I could prove I wasn't mentally ill, which I resisted mightily for many years, was to get off medication and do well. And so I kept trying and trying and trying. I decided to make one last effort to get off. I thought I never really tried hard enough. I put a lot of extra supports in place to help keep me true to my goal. And so I started the reduction. I hid what I was feeling when I started feeling bad. The days and nights were harder now. The sheer physical effort of containing my body and my thoughts felt like trying to hold back a team of wild horses. Sleep was spotty and filled with dreams that left me awake and sweating in terror. Nevertheless, I dropped down again. Months before, I accepted an invitation to present at a workshop at Oxford. By the time I boarded the plane for home, I was a complete wreck. When I walked into Kaplan's office my first day back, I headed straight for the corner, crouched down on the floor, and began to shake. All around me were thoughts of evil beings poised with daggers. They'd slice me up in thin slices or make me swallow hot coals. Kaplan would later describe me as, quote, writhing in agony. Even in this state, what he accurately described as, quote, acutely and floridly psychotic, unquote, I refused to take more meds. The mission is not yet complete. Immediately after the appointment with Kaplan, I went to see Dr. Martyr, a schizophrenia expert who was following me for a movement disorder caused by the meds called tardive dyskinesia, or TD. He'd never seen me ill before and had been under the impression, and I hadn't disabused him of it, that I had a mild psychotic illness and that my primary concern was avoiding or minimizing TD. Once in his office, I sat on his couch, folded over, and began muttering. I was disheveled. I couldn't remember when I'd ate or what I'd eaten. When had I bathed? In Oxford? Before Oxford? Did it matter if we were going to all die anyway? Anyone who walked into that room that day would have thought Martyr was treating a schizophrenic street person. A week later, people told me that's exactly what I looked like. Head explosions and people trying to kill. Is it okay if I totally trash your office? You need to leave if you think you're going to do that, said Martyr. Okay, small, fire on ice. Tell them not to kill me. Tell them not to kill me. What have I done wrong? All the explosions, hundreds of thousands with thoughts, interdiction. Elyn, do you feel you're dangerous to other people or to yourself, he asked. That's a trick question. I said, I don't think you ask a mental health law professor if she meets the criteria for commitment in the language of the statutes. I'm not sure how you do it, but not that way. No, it's not a trick question, he said. I'm serious. I think you need to be in the hospital. I could get you into UCLA right now and the whole thing could be very discreet. Ha, ha, ha. You're offering to put me in the hospital? Hospitals are bad. They're mad. They're sad. One must stay away. I'm God, or I used to be. I give life and I take it away. Forgive me, for I know not what I do. I really think a hospital would be a good idea, Martyr said. No, thank you oh so very much, I said. All right then, but if I were you, I'd stay away from work for a while. You don't want your colleagues to see this. Thanks, banks, bang, bye. See you soon. Oblivious to the look on his face, I left. The next morning, I did drag myself to my office, my hideout and my refuge. I ran into my colleague Anne in the hall, and he quickly figured out what was happening. Elyn, what the hell is going on? I thought you were kidding at first, but you're not, are you? Does anyone else know about this? Is it okay for anyone else to know? I wouldn't mind telling Michael, I said, not the archangel one, our colleague. Ending the passage. Suffice to say that Ed eventually brought me home, showing the good judgment to follow my psychiatrist's advice rather than tackle me to the ground and take me to the ER, as others, including Ed's internist wife, were recommending. Eventually, I acceded to everybody's demand to take more medication. I could no longer deny the truth, and I could not change it. The wall that kept me, Elyn, Professor Saks, separate from the insane woman I had once seen in that mirror long ago, lay smashed and in ruins. And then another event pushed me past the point of no return in accepting that I indeed had a mental illness. I got on a new drug, reading from the text. Because of the risks of my meds, Kaplan suggested one of the new classes of an antipsychotic, a drug called Zyprexa. Parenthetically, I was on like double the maximum dose and still having a lot of breakthrough symptoms, so I switched to clozapine, which is not perfect, but it's really been a miracle drug. Anyway, with the olanzapine, the change was fast and dramatic. First, the side effects were much less than with the Navain. More important, the clinical result was, not to overstate it, like daylight dawning after a long night. I could see the world in a way I'd never seen it before. The illness was still there, but it wasn't pushing me around as much as it once did. Finally, I could focus on the task at hand, unencumbered by the threat of lurking demons. The most profound effect of the new drug was to convince me once and for all that I actually had a real illness. For 20 years, as I said, I'd struggled with that acceptance, managing to hold on to the belief that basically there was nothing unusual about my thoughts. Everyone's mind contained the chaos that mine did. It's just that they were all much better at managing it than I was. My problem, I thought, had less to do with my mind than it had to do with my lack of social graces. I wasn't mentally ill. I was socially maladroit. Of course, that wasn't true. There's no way to overstate what a thunderclap this revelation was to me. And with it, my final and most profound resistance to the idea that I was mentally ill began to give way. Ironically, the more I accepted I had a mental illness, the less the illness defined me. It became accident and not essence, at which point the riptide that had kept sucking me in set me free, ending the passage. I was finally able to integrate these three aspects of myself. I was indeed Elyn, the professor, and the lady of the medical charts. It was making my peace with the lady of the medical charts, my mental illness, that allowed Elyn and the professor to flourish and enjoy the many wonderful relationships that have blessed my life. As fortunate and blessed as my life has been, I don't want to leave you with the impression that everything is smooth sailing. Not too long ago, my medications became unbalanced and I was involved in a traffic accident. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but I was arrested and handcuffed, put in the back of a police car, and spent several hours handcuffed in the police station. It was a painful, humiliating, inconvenient, and expensive incident that brought back many bad memories. When you've been restrained, being handcuffed is especially toxic. I had the resources in my life to take care of what happened. Many people with mental illness do not. Could all of you here who are advocates for people with mental illness please raise your hands? Wow, fantastic. When people like you take care of people like me who may not have the resources, it's really important. On behalf of others with psychiatric illness, thank you from the bottom of my heart. So I'm deeply grateful also to the organizers of this conference, to those who are speaking, and to you who are attending. It's true that voices from different branches of the government are speaking with clinicians. And it is essential that those of us with lived experience have a voice in every part of the conversation. We are your sisters, your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your colleagues, and your friends. We want, in the words of Sigmund Freud, what everyone wants, to work and to love. Thank you for helping us work and love. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Rachel Post. Thank you so much for sharing your beautiful story. I work for an organization that historically identifies as serving people with substance use disorders. We now also provide community mental health services. One thing that's been interesting to me as somebody who started off in the community mental health field, but then moved into an organization that started providing substance use disorder services, is the difference in the role of peers, at least from my organization, where nearly half of our workforce are people who have lived experience, from people who are not only on the front lines, but from directors of million-dollar programs. And so it's interesting to just see, for me, the disconnect, like how much we value people with lived experience in the profession of services for substance use disorders compared to the disparity in the role of people with lived mental health experiences in community mental health. And I'm wondering if you have any advice to community mental health providers or administrators about how to do better by incorporating people with lived experience into those kinds of positions.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm not really sure kind of historically what the etiology of that difference is. It may be because the general public understands more and stigmatizes less substance abuse, and that they stigmatize more and maybe are more afraid of people with mental health disorders. I do think there's been kind of a movement to involve us in this arena. So we have peer networks and so on. I think those are really terrific. I've also had cancer. Nobody understands the experience of cancer or the experience of mental illness as much as someone who him or herself suffers from those illnesses. So it can provide an opportunity to speak with someone who understands firsthand. You might trust them more. You might feel more identified with them, and all those kinds of things. And maybe what you do is, your county department of mental health, sets up a division that's a consumer advocate division where peers are employed and are part of the condition, the manner of approaching other people with lived experience. But it is a good question, and it's sort of, kind of telling that there is this difference. Thank you.
And I thank you too, Elyn.
Thanks.
And my question concerns metabolic syndrome.
Sorry, where are you?
Where am I?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Oh. Okay. Okay.
There you are. I'm right here. My question concerns metabolic syndrome. So many have become obese.
Right.
Do you have a secret? How have you avoided that?
You know, it's a good question. The stats, so say on clozapine and Zyprexa both make you gain a whole lot of weight. You know, I think, 50% or even 80% gain 25 pounds and 25% gain 60 pounds. I'm sort of making up these numbers, but it's a big incidence of people who develop that. And then obviously that increases the risk of metabolic syndrome. You know, I just may be one of the lucky ones. I will say that I used to be really lucky in that I was one of the people who, if I just ate until I was full, I wouldn't gain weight. And when I got on the drugs, if I started eating until I was full, I would gain weight. So for the first 2 weeks I was on Zyprexa, I gained 12 pounds, in 2 weeks, which was really horrifying. But then I started seeing a nutritionist and just being very attentive to what I was eating and that kind of thing. And I eat everything. I eat chocolate and I eat ice cream and as well as cheese and, omelets and stuff like that. But I try to, eat in moderation and so on. So, also, I'm not sure what percentage of people with mental health disorders, how much more obese they are than the general public. Because isn't it true that like 60% of the public is obese? But,
Elyn, I wanted to comment on something you said. You said that Freud said that part of his point was that in individuals that present psychosis did not form strong therapeutic relationships, and I know that to be wrong.
Right.
I practiced psychiatry in the past, not here in Oregon, but in Brazil, and had many patients that were psychotic and had, in fact, just the opposite, the most intense transference that I and I'm trained in psychoanalysis.
I totally agree with that.
In Brazil as well. But my point, my question back to you is, so how do you see the combination of factors that actually helped you recover? What was the combination that really the secret sauce that helped you enter recovery? I think you spoke a little bit about it, but I think it's a very important point that you made about the relationship.
Yes,
you're right. So I would love to just highlight that.
Okay. So one of the points was about, can psychotic patients form transferences? And this doctor says that she certainly has had the experience with her patients that they do. They may be psychotic transfers. I kid around that I went from thinking that my analysts were monsters and trying to kill me to thinking that they just didn't like me. So I went from kind of a psychotic transference to a neurotic transference. And then the other question is what combination of facts were helpful in my recovery? I'm going to say two things: the combination of facts in different arenas, and then focus on the psychoanalytic relationship. So I think there were three things that helped with recovery. One, excellent treatment, both excellent psychopharmacology and excellent analysis. I know the theory analysis is supposed to end, but I'm a lifer because I don't want to risk, as I think I said in my talk. But the meds have helped too, and I struggled a lot around the need to take meds, and we can talk about that. I have a bunch of ideas why people do. So treatment, wonderfully supportive and caring friends and family who both gave a richness and depth to my life and served as another set of eyes when I started going downhill. Actually, Steve once called my analyst and said, Elyn tells me you're going to China, and she says she's going to go there in advance of your trip and wipe it out of all the bad people, to which he said, oh, how very considerate of her. And then the third thing is really accommodating and intellectually stimulating workplace. For me, when I'm writing an argument or a counter argument, the psychotic stuff recedes to the sidelines. I like to say my mind is both my best friend and my worst enemy. So should I also talk about how therapy helps? So I think it does a bunch of things, and these are not all specific to psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic therapy. But there are some of the things that have contributed, I think, to recovery, to my recovery. And the first is that stress is bad for any illness, and particularly psychiatric illness. And the analysis can help you understand and either cope with or avoid stressors. Second, it fortifies an observing ego, sort of where you kind of stand back and survey what's going on in your mind and try to make sense of it or reject it if it seems crazy or whatever. Third, it's a safe place to bring your scary and violent thoughts. Sort of acts as a kind of steam valve. If you say it in the therapy, you don't have to say it in your outside world, which is a really good thing. Then it offers insight, which can sometimes be helpful. So I think some people think that psychotic symptoms are random firings of neurons that have no meaning. I don't think any analyst would think that, but some people also think that they do have a meaning, that they tell the truth about your psychic reality, but that it doesn't help the patient to interpret because the patient can't hear it. And then the third view is it has a meaning, and interpreting can at times really be helpful, and that really was my experience. So once I was, saying violent things, and my doctor said, "Elyn, I think you're saying these violent things because you're really scared. The violence is your defense against fear," and that made a lot of sense to me. Also, it's very empowering to someone who accepts you not only for the good, but also for the bad and ugly, as I said with Mrs. Jones. Another way to think of this is that people today don't speak so much about reduction and remission of symptoms, but about quality of life. And importantly, it's for the person, her or himself, to say what that is for them. But I think therapy can help. Institute programming was on, quote, criminalization of mental illness. And it's a scandal and a tragedy that people with LA County Jail and Cook County Prison are kind of the biggest psych facilities in the country. That's a scandal and a horror. It's really awful. And what can we do about that? Well, one thing I think is, the advent of mental health courts. So we have domestic violence courts and veterans courts and substance abuse courts, and certain places are now starting to establish mental health courts. And you opt into it. You don't get forced into it. So the defendant and the person will be, quote, sentenced to treatment instead of jail or prison. And if they successfully do what they're supposed to do in the community, they can have their criminal record expunged. Jail and prison are no place for someone with mental health disorders. A student of mine did a documentary about, turned out she was Marlon Brando's daughter. I didn't even know that, but she did a documentary about people, on Skid Row who have mental illness. And one of the guys was like, "Well, I get picked up very frequently and get taken in for trespassing and disturbing the peace and vagrancy, all those kinds of status offenses. And I'm in jail, and the jailer says, 'Get in line.' And I get in line, but then the voices tell me to go over there. So I go over there and I get beat up and have an infraction marked against me. And there's a lot of evidence that people with the same conviction and the same sentence spend longer time in jail or prison if they have a mental health disorder than if they don't. So this is something we need to really try to address. And I'm gratified that more places are doing that, and I hope more and more do it. I don't know, do you have a mental health court here?
Well, I'm in federal court.
Oh, you're in federal court.
Unfortunately, do not.
Yeah.
But the bigger problem is, there are actually clients of mine who, for the first time, have gotten help on supervision.
Right.
But supervision ends, and we're all happy they're successfully complete, but then they're out in the real world with no help.
Yeah, no, that's an incredibly important point, that we ought to provide services to help people re-enter. How on earth are people going to do okay if you just kind of cut them loose without help? I totally agree with that.
Hello, my name is Kelsey. Abiding by the Supreme Court ruling of Olmstead Act for certain commitment types, how influential do you feel in least restrictive environment is, and how key do you feel it is to recovery for persons with mental health issues?
So is the least restrictive alternative sort of doctrine helpful to people in recovery? I think so. I think the principle of least restrictive alternative should be applied to everything. If you can take fewer rights away and still achieve the same purpose, then why wouldn't we do that? And I think it also sends the message to consumers, to people with lived experience and people in recovery, that we value their liberty as much as we value anybody else's liberty, and we're going to try as best we can to infringe on it as little as we can. So. Sure, thanks.
Thank you, Elyn.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.